What Judge Judy did in court today will leave your jaw on the floor. We are diving deep into the courtroom drama, where a ruthless landlord tries to justify evicting a single black mother. But Judge Judy is not having it. Stay till the end to hear the shocking twist from the secret judge. Judy files the world was never meant to see. Court was called to order just after 10 in the morning. The bright overhead lights in the studio courtroom buzzed faintly as the camera zoomed in. The bailiff stepped forward and spoke with clarity that echoed against the walls. The courtroom stood as Judge Judy walked in, with that unmistakable look of determination etched on her face. Her black robe moved like armor. Her eyes scanned the room like a hawk. She took her seat in the judge's chair. The American and New York flags draped proudly behind her. The wall stood firm and clean with a slight glimmer in the morning light. Everyone sat. The bailiff announced the case number 1. Taylor Davis versus Charles Whitman. A landlord-tenant dispute judge. Judy looked down at the case file in front of her. Then she lifted her head with a piercing glare that silenced even the whispers in the room. She spoke directly to Taylor, Miss Davis. Step forward and tell me what happened. Do not waste my time. Taylor Davis was a young black woman in her late 20s. Her posture showed both fear and fight. Her dress was neat, her voice soft but steady. She stepped up with her hands clutched together and nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I was renting an apartment from Mr. Whitman for almost a year. Everything was fine until I lost my job due to layoffs. I told him I was looking for work and that I could pay part of the rent. Judge. Judy held up a hand. Stop. Did you ever miss a full rent payment? Taylor replied calmly, No, ma'am. I always paid something. I also showed him a letter from my job, saying I was let go due to downsizing. But after that he started acting differently. He would show up unannounced. Ask me weird questions. Like where my baby daddy was, and if I had too many people living with me. I live there with just my son. That is it. The room shifted slightly. A few people whispered, but were quickly silenced by the sharp tap of the judge's pen. Judge. Judy turned to Charles Whitman. He was a man in his late 40s, white, wearing a beige blazer that looked too expensive for a landlord who claimed he had to evict a tenant for non-payment. Judge. Judy narrowed her eyes. Mr. Whitman. Your side. Charles cleared his throat and spoke with a half smile. Your Honor. She was late on rent. Several times. And she violated the lease by having guests over. I have neighbors who complained about noise. And when I asked her to leave peacefully, she refused. Taylor immediately turned toward the judge. That is not true. I have never had loud guests. The only person who visits is my sister. She helps me with my son while I look for work. Judge. Judy leaned forward with her elbows on the bench. Her tone cut through the room like a razor. Mr. Whitman. Did you file an official complaint before starting the eviction process? Charles looked to the side and answered slowly, No. But I warned her. Several times verbally. Judge Judy tapped her pen on the file. You did not give written notice. No formal letter. No legal document. Just your word against hers. Charles shrugged. Well, yes. I mean, I did not want to make it a big legal thing. Taylor's eyes widened. He gave me 3 days' notice, and then locked me out. I could not even get my son's things. The room grew quiet. The gallery leaned in. Judge Judy's face tightened. You locked her out without a court order. Charles hesitated. I thought I could. I mean, she was behind, and I assumed. Judge Judy raised her voice. You assumed wrong. You do not get to play sheriff because you think someone is behind. That is illegal. Taylor wiped her eye and nodded. My son is 4 years old. I had to sleep in my sister's car for 2 nights before we found a shelter. The air got heavy in the room. Every eye turned toward the judge. She stared at Charles for several seconds. Then she turned to her clerk and spoke calmly. Pull up the tenant laws for the state. I want to make sure I am not about to burn this man legally and morally at the same time. The courtroom laughed nervously. Even the bailiff cracked a smile. But Judge Judy did not. Taylor, did you ever threaten this man or cause damage to the apartment? Taylor shook her head firmly. No, ma'am. I kept it clean. I still have the key. I was waiting to see if I could get back in and get our things. Judge Judy looked at Charles. Why did you not let her collect her belongings? He shrugged again. I did not feel safe. She could have done something. Judge Judy snapped. That is not your call. You do not get to assume criminal intent just because someone is black and behind on rent. That is not how this court works. The audience reacted with shock, and a few people clapped before being hushed by the bailiff. Taylor held her breath. Judge Judy turned back to her. Taylor, did you record any of your conversations with him? Did he ever say anything that made you feel singled out? Taylor nodded. Yes, ma'am. I have a recording on my phone. He asked me if I was planning to bring more baby daddies around. He said, people like me bring the property value down. A chill went through the courtroom. Judge Judy sat back, her face cold and thoughtful. She looked at her clerk. Play the recording. A moment later, the courtroom heard the voice of Charles on the phone. His tone was casual, but the words were sharp. I do not want my property looking like the ghetto. You people bring that mess everywhere. Taylor's voice on the recording was calm and tired. All I asked for was another week. Charles responded, you do not belong here. I should have never rented to you. The audio ended. Silence filled the room like a storm cloud. Judge Judy slowly stood up. Her voice thundered across the courtroom. Mr. Whitman, that recording alone is enough to send you straight to a civil rights attorney's desk with $1 million lawsuit in hand. You discriminated against her based on race. You illegally evicted her. You refused to return her property. And you made assumptions that have no place in decent society. Charles looked like he had just swallowed fire, Your Honor. Judge Judy raised a hand. No. You do not speak now. You listen. The courtroom stayed frozen. Taylor stood silent. Her eyes glossy but steady. Judge Judy turned to the camera and spoke clearly. Let this be a lesson. Eviction is a legal process. Discrimination is illegal. And people like Mr. Whitman, who think they can act without consequence, will always face the truth in my courtroom. The camera zoomed in on her face as the screen beginning. The gavel had fallen, but the justice had only started. The courtroom resumed its tense rhythm. Its tense rhythm. Judge Judy remained seated, but leaned forward just slightly, her hands resting firmly on the bench. Her eyes were sharp as glass and cold as steel. Charles Whitman sat across from her, trying to avoid eye contact with anyone. Taylor Davis stood still, her face full of emotion, but her body steady like she had waited her entire life to be heard. Judge Judy looked down at the file. Then back up. Before I decide on damages, we need to address every angle of this situation. I want both of you to listen carefully. Because if either of you interrupts me again, I will hold you in contempt. The gallery was silent. You could almost hear the breath being held in the back row. Judge Judy turned to her clerk. Read the lease agreement. Start from the terms regarding eviction and tenant removal. The young clerk cleared her throat and began reading. Tenant shall be given written notice, no less than 30 days before termination of lease, unless tenant is in violation of criminal activity. In cases of failure to pay rent, tenant must be served with a 3-day notice followed by legal proceedings through the housing court. Lockout procedures without judicial approval are not permitted under any circumstances. Judge Judy nodded and tapped her pen on the desk with purpose. So, Mr. Whitman, according to your own lease, what did you violate? Charles hesitated and muttered, I did not file in court. I just gave notice. She was behind, and I acted. Judge Judy raised her eyebrows. You acted. Without authority, without paperwork, without even checking tenant protection laws. And now you are here trying to explain why you thought that was justified. Charles's eyes fell to the ground. Taylor slowly turned her head toward him. But she did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence was louder than any outburst. Judge Judy leaned back and addressed Taylor directly. Miss Davis, do you have any photographs or video of the apartment's condition at the time you were evicted? Taylor nodded and handed her phone to the bailiff, who passed it forward. Judge Judy swiped through the photos with quick efficiency. Pictures of a clean, modest apartment. Toys neatly organized in a corner. Dishes clean in the sink. A crib. A Bible on the nightstand. Everything intact. Judge Judy looked at Charles. You claim she damaged the property. But this looks better than my own guest room. Where is the damage? Charles shrugged, again with that weak smile. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe I was reacting emotionally. Judge Judy narrowed her eyes. You were reacting to race. You were reacting to bias. And you were reacting with the arrogance of someone who thinks poor equals less than. This woman did everything right. She paid what she could. She communicated. And you punished her for having to struggle. Taylor quietly wiped her eye. But she stayed standing tall, Judge Judy turned to the clerk again. Pull up the case of New York. Housing Authority versus Bellman. I want to cite precedent. The clerk nodded and scrolled through a digital file. In the case of NYH versus Bellman, the court ruled that landlords who evicted tenants without formal notice or judicial action were liable for both damages and civil penalties. The tenant was awarded 5 times the monthly rent amount, plus compensation for emotional distress. Judge Judy looked at Taylor. How much was your monthly rent? Taylor replied $900. Judge Judy wrote something down quickly. 5 times that is $4,500. Then I will add an extra $2,000 for the emotional damage of being forced to sleep in a car with a child. On top of that, I am issuing a separate order for your personal belongings to be returned or replaced within 7 days. Charles jumped in your honor. That is a lot. I did not mean to hurt her. Judge Judy slammed her pen down, but you did. And meaning does not erase impact. You do not get to decide what people deserve based on their skin tone or their paycheck. And you certainly do not get to play victim after committing the wrong. The room stayed quiet, but the temperature had shifted. It was no longer about an argument. It was about a truth being forced into the open. Judge Judy continued. You know what bothers me the most, Mr. Whitman? You assume that because she is a single black mother, she would not fight back. You assumed no one would care. But this is my courtroom. And I care. Charles dropped his head in shame. Judge Judy looked at Taylor again. Miss Davis, do you have any requests beyond damages? Taylor took a moment, then nodded. Yes, ma'am. I want to make sure this does not happen to someone else. He owns other buildings. I just want a record so that people know what he did. Judge Judy nodded slowly. Then I will refer this case to the Housing Authority with a note on discriminatory conduct. If I had the power, I would revoke his license. But I will do everything in my power to put him under the microscope. The bailiff stepped closer to Charles and handed him a clipboard. You will sign this agreement to pay restitution immediately. Failure to comply will lead to further legal action. Charles took the pen with shaking hands. He signed without protest. Judge Judy stood up from her chair. This case is closed. But for Mr. Whitman, it is far from over. Let the cameras show that justice does not care what color your tie is. Only what kind of person you choose to be. The gallery slowly stood. Taylor looked up and took a deep breath. Her son was waiting outside with her sister. But inside that courtroom, something heavy had been lifted. Judge Judy gathered her files and stepped off the bench without a word. But everyone felt the weight of her judgment. It lingered long after the sound of her footsteps faded down the hall. As the courtroom cleared out, Taylor turned and looked at the chair where she had stood. It no longer felt like there was one trial. It felt like the place she finally stood her ground. The camera faded to black, and the next section would bring even more revelation. No. Judy had just exited the courtroom. Nestled exited the courtroom. But the atmosphere remained electric. Taylor Davis gathered her things slowly, still processing the weight of the decision. Her hands trembled slightly, but her heart felt stronger than ever. As the gallery emptied, a man in a grey suit approached Taylor cautiously. He had a briefcase and a calm but serious expression. He looked familiar to the court staff, but Taylor had never seen him before. "Ma'am, my name is Daniel Brooks. I represent the local Tenants' Rights Coalition. We have been investigating Charles Whitman for over a year." Taylor blinked. She had not expected this. Daniel continued. "We had a tip months ago that he was targeting black tenants with informal evictions and off-the books removals. What you did in that courtroom. For the door we have been trying through for a long time." Taylor felt a rush of Daniel, looked around and lowered his voice just slightly. "Did not get to see today." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a flash drive. "This contains several audio recordings of Mr. Whitman speaking to property managers. We commanding hoarding and murders of Mr. Property Manager. He refers to tenants by race. He discusses finding ways to move certain people out without attracting attention. We could not submit this before because we needed a public ruling to avoid compromising our sources." Taylor looked at the flash drive. "Are you going to give this to Judge Judy?" Daniel nodded. "With your permission. And we want you to testify in a civil case against him that will address multiple tenants." "You a moment alone." Taylor hesitated for only a moment. "I am in. The next morning, Judge Judy sat at her desk in chambers when her clerk entered with a file marked "Confidential Judge." This came in from the Tenants' Coalition. "You will want to hear this, Judge." Judy took the flash drive and plugged it into the court's computer system. Her eyes narrowed as the first recording played. Charles Whitman's voice came through clearly. "I do not care if they pay on time. I do not want Section 8 folks cluttering up my properties. I got a few of them out just by changing the locks while they were at work. No court needed." Judge Judy hit pause and turned to the clerk. "Get Mr. Whitman back in my courtroom today." Back in the courtroom, Judge Judy resumed her place at the bench. Taylor Davis sat once again, this time joined by 3 other women who had come forward after seeing the previous day's ruling. They sat with hands folded but eyes burning with quiet fury. Charles Whitman was escorted in by the bailiff. He looked pale and visibly shaken. The cameras were already rolling. Judge Judy wasted no time. "Mr. Whitman, this court has received new evidence from the local Tenants' Rights Coalition. This evidence includes recorded statements where you admit to evicting tenants based on race and without due process." Charles opened his mouth to speak. Judge Judy raised her hand to silence him. "Do not say a word. I listened to your voice with my own ears. I heard you degrade the people who lived under your roofs, people who trusted you with their safety. And the worst part is you did it proudly." One of the women seated beside Taylor began to weep quietly. Judge Judy turned to her gently. Miss Green, I understand you were also forced out of your apartment without legal notice. The woman nodded. Yes, ma'am. I came home from work, and all my things were in the hallway. He had already changed the locks. My rent was paid up for the month, Judge. Judy made a quick note. Miss Carter. You too? The second woman nodded. He told me I was attracting too much noise from family visits. But my family only came over once a month for Sunday dinner. That was the excuse he gave. Judge Judy's pen tapped again, and Miss Fields. The last woman answered. He told me to move out because he was renovating. But the next week another tenant was moved in. White tenant. Same rent. No renovations. Judge Judy turned back to Charles Whitman. I want you to understand what is happening here. This is not about one tenant anymore. This is about a pattern, a dangerous one. And this court will not be your shield. It will be your mirror. Charles tried to explain. That was locker room talk. That is not how I actually acted, Judge. Judy slammed her hand on the desk. Locker room talk is not a defense. And even if it were, this is not a locker room. This is a courtroom, a place of law, a place of truth. She turned to the camera and then to the audience. There are landlords all over this country who think they can act like kings of their castles. But being a landlord is not a license to discriminate. It is a responsibility. And today, that responsibility is coming due. Charles slumped back in his chair. The three women held hands beside Taylor. The court gallery was silent once more. But it was a silence made of reverence. Not fear. Judge Judy stood. A full investigation into Mr. Whitman's properties will be launched. I am forwarding this evidence to the housing department and the city attorney. Any tenant found to have been illegally removed will be compensated by court order. And let this be the first of many such cases to reach this courtroom. Taylor looked up, her eyes wide with gratitude. But she said nothing. She did not need to. The truth had spoken for her, and in Judge Judy's court, the truth still mattered. The bailiff stepped forward to escort Charles out again. But this time, he walked a little slower. He knew now. There was no escaping the voice of justice, and that voice was loud today, louder than ever. Judge Judy remained seated with the benches. Charles Whitman was escorted out of the courtroom. She turned to the court clerk and gave a clear instruction. Summon the city attorney. Tell them this is now a matter of public interest. I want a formal review of every eviction Whitman has processed in the last 5 years. The clerk nodded and left quickly. Meanwhile, the courtroom remained still. Taylor Davis and the other women exchanged glances, a shared sense of validation passing between them. 20 minutes later, the double doors opened. A tall man in a navy blue suit stepped in. He carried a briefcase in one hand and a badge clipped to the other side of his coat. His name was David McClure, and he was known for prosecuting housing discrimination with intensity and precision. He bowed slightly to Judge Judy before speaking. Your Honor, I received your summons. I have reviewed the recordings and the statements submitted by the coalition. Judge Judy nodded. And your position? David's voice was firm. We will be opening a class action case against Charles Whitman effective immediately. I would also like to make a formal request to use this courtroom as the venue for our hearing. Given the significance of your rulings and the public interest involved, Judge Judy looked across the room at the women still seated with Taylor. Are you willing to be the face of this slowly? If it will protect others like me. David stepped forward and placed a formal document on the judge's desk. This is the initial filing. Across the room in the official filing. We will need at least 10 more plaintiffs to meet the threshold. But based on what we know, there will be more than enough by the end of the week. Judge Judy skimmed the document. You have my courtroom. But I expect integrity. No theatrics. No grandstanding. This court is about truth. Not headlines. David nodded. Understood. Judge Judy stood and looked around the room. This hearing is adjourned. But let me be clear. The next time we sit in this room, it will not be just about one landlord. It will be about a system that allowed this to happen for years without consequence. That system ends here. As the courtroom emptied, Taylor felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. For the first time, she was not a victim. She was a witness, a voice. The following week, the courtroom was once again full. 10 women now sat behind Taylor, and 2 men joined them as well. Each had their own story of silent eviction or quiet discrimination. And each had come to speak. Judge Judy resumed her place, looking across the courtroom like a commander returning to the front lines. City Attorney. Begin. David stood and called the first witness. Please state your name. The woman at the stand spoke clearly. Angela Peters. David nodded. Miss Peters. What happened to you under the management of Charles Whitman? Angela's voice cracked just slightly. I received a notice saying the building was being condemned. That we had 30 days to leave. I did not have time to question it. But the next month, the building reopened with new tenants. None of them looked like me, David continued. Did you receive any offer of relocation or support? Angela shook her head. Not a dollar. David turned to Judge Judy. Your Honor, I would like to submit property renovation records for that address. They indicate no structural issues and no permits filed for major work. The claim of condemnation was fabricated. Judge Judy scribbled something on her notepad, then turned her eyes to the defense table. Charles Whitman was seated with his attorney, a younger man who looked more nervous by the minute. Do you wish to challenge the claim? The attorney stuttered. We reserve the right to investigate further. Judge Judy responded immediately. You have until the end of this hearing. After that, this court will not tolerate delay tactics. David continued to call witnesses. Each story was more disturbing than the last. An elderly man named Harold explained how he was evicted while in the hospital. A single mother named Denise testified that her lease was voided because she installed a baby gate without written permission. Another tenant was forced out after complaining about mold. Judy's eyes never left the witnesses. She listened, absorbed, judged, and then came the final witness. Taylor Davis returned to the stand. The courtroom was still as she began. I stood here before, alone. But I am not alone anymore. Charles Whitman did not just take my apartment. He tried to take my dignity, and he almost succeeded. Almost. She looked across at the other tenants, but something happened in this courtroom. I found my voice. We all did. And now, I want every landlord watching this to understand something. You are not untouchable. You are accountable. And the days of getting away with this are over. Judy nodded slowly. Then she looked down at the bench for a long moment before speaking. This court finds a pattern of racial discrimination consistent across multiple properties and multiple years. Charles Whitman will be referred to the Department of Housing and Urban Development for federal investigation. In addition, this court will order restitution for every plaintiff who testified here. Today, gasps moved through the gallery. Judge Judy raised her hand. This is not a victory. It is a correction. And there are many more corrections to come. She turned to Charles Whitman. You built your wealth on the backs of the people in this room. You thought they had no power. You thought the system would shield you. But what you forgot is that courts do not belong to landlords. They belong to the people. And today, the people have spoken. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. Court is dismissed. Taylor walked out of that courtroom, not just with justice, but with legacy. She had stood up when it mattered, and now the city would follow. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as Judge Judy called the court back into session. This time, Charles Whitman looked different. His suit was still crisp, but his posture was deflated. Gone was the smug grin. In its place was a man surrounded by consequences. His attorney fidgeted beside him, flipping through paperwork that seemed less useful by the minute. Judge Judy looked at both sides and spoke with a stern but composed voice. We will now hear the defense. Mr. Whitman, you and your attorney may present your side, but understand this clearly. This court will not tolerate lies. We have heard from the people. Now let us hear from the one who silenced them. The room went still. Charles Whitman's attorney stood slowly and approached the bench. Your Honor, we would like to state that my client has followed the law in all his proceedings. There is no direct evidence of racial discrimination. Any evictions processed were within legal parameters. We argue that the city attorney's case is based on anecdotal testimony and lacks legal foundation. Judge Judy raised her eyebrow. You mean to say that 11 individual stories across different properties over 5 years all sound the same by coincidence? The attorney cleared his throat. To a proud and improbable by law. Judge Judy leaned forward. Very well. Lastly, belong in first stories. On the Samaru, very well. Proceed with your evidence. The attorney began presenting eviction notices. One by one. Pages filled with legal jargon, eviction dates, Minor lease violations. Missed rent by 1 day. Unauthorized furniture on porches. No pet paperwork for a fish tank. Judy flipped through them. These are eviction notices, so thin I could see through them if I held them to the light. The attorney tried to continue each of his actions. Was legal. Judge Judy interrupted. Legal is not always just. And you are not in front of a vending machine. You are in front of a judge, Charles. Whitman finally stood up. He did not wait for his attorney. His voice cracked as he spoke. I did not know their situations. I only saw paperwork. I have hundreds of tenants. I followed the rules. That is all. Judge Judy looked him directly in the eye. You followed rules designed to keep you comfortable, not to keep people safe. And you thought no one would ever look closer. But here we are. She turned back to the attorney. Anything else? The attorney sighed. We request leniency. If your honor deems any action improper, we ask for civil penalties only and no criminal referrals. The courtroom whispered. David McClure stood up immediately. Your honor. That man illegally evicted vulnerable families. He lied on city filings. He profited from deceit. He needs to be made an example. Judge Judy raised her hand to quiet them. Both. I will decide what he needs. That is not your role. That is mine. She paused. Then stood. I have heard enough. Both from those who suffered and those who orchestrated the suffering. We will now move to sentencing. The tension in the room was thick. Everyone could feel it. Taylor Davis held her breath. Angela Peters reached for her neighbor's hand. David stood still. The judge spoke slowly and clearly. Charles Whitman. This court finds you guilty of unlawful eviction practices. This court finds that those practices disproportionately targeted black tenants. This court finds your actions reckless, calculated, and systemic. She looked down at the defense table. You will pay restitution to each tenant in the amount of $20,000. You will vacate ownership of all residential buildings acquired through fraudulent eviction. You will be barred from managing or owning rental property in this state for a period of 15 years. She raised her eyes again. In addition, I will be submitting a formal letter to the federal prosecutor. Your filings contain falsified claims. This court believes there are grounds for a federal housing fraud case. Gasps again rippled through the courtroom. Judge Judy remained still. Let that be the last time a landlord in this city mistakes silence for permission. She banged a gavel once. This court is dismissed. People in the gallery erupted. Erupted. Not in cheers, but in relief, in quiet victory. A few hugged. Others sat still in disbelief. Charles Whitman sat in his chair, frozen. His life had changed forever. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered. Flashbulbs lit the front steps. Taylor Davis stepped out into the daylight with her head high. Angela beside her. Denise following. All of them no longer hidden. One of the reporters rushed up. Miss Davis. How does it feel to win? She looked into the camera. This was never about winning. This was about being seen and heard. And now we are, as the camera panned over the courthouse, Judge Judy exited through a side door. Her face was composed, but in her eyes was fire. She had not just presided over a hearing. She had struck a match. The courtroom had emptied, but its energy remained. Judge Judy sat alone for a moment at the bench, reviewing the case folder. The court reporter had packed up. The bailiff stood silently by the door. Still, the judge did not move. She stared at the paperwork in front of her, a stack of eviction notices, a folder of affidavits, a list of names. Names that had once meant little to anyone outside the file cabinets of city housing. Names that now had a voice. Judge Judy whispered to herself. Every name has a life behind it, she stood. Handed the bailiff the folder. Then turned off the microphone and walked toward her chambers. But even with the courtroom now empty of bodies, it was not empty of sound. The memory of Taylor's trembling voice still echoed. The sound of Charles Whitman's half-hearted defense. The third of the gavel like a final heartbeat in the long struggle for dignity. Meanwhile, in a smaller courtroom next door, Judge Judy had scheduled a hearing with the City Housing Authority. David McClure was waiting outside the room, pacing slowly with his notepad in hand. He had brought more than legal documents. He had brought proposals. Because this case was not just about one racist landlord. It was about the system that allowed men like Charles Whitman to thrive. Judge Judy entered the room and immediately signaled to begin. Mr. McClure, you asked for this meeting. I assume you have something worth our time. David nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We need policy change, not just punishment. The structure of tenant oversight in this city is broken. It took us years to even notice the pattern. We need stronger tracking systems, mandatory bias audits, anonymous reporting channels, and real enforcement. Judge Judy looked toward the city housing officials sitting across the table. Their faces were neutral. Politically careful, Judge Judy spoke. What happened in that courtroom today should never have reached a courtroom. It should have been stopped at the first family, not the 50th. Do you understand what that means? One of the housing officials responded quietly. We understand the gravity, Your Honor, but the city budget is limited. These programs require funding, staff, technology. Judge Judy interrupted. And if we do nothing, what is the cost then? More children in shelters, more black mothers on sidewalks. Is that cheaper for you? The room went silent. David stepped in again. I am prepared to draft language for a pilot program. I will volunteer pro bono oversight. I know community partners ready to assist. You do not need to do everything today, but you need to start today. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair. Tap the table once. You will have 1 month. Submit the plan to my office, and let it include the names of the families we failed. Every policy line, every bullet point. I wanted to honor them. The officials nodded. Some reluctantly, some with respect. The meeting was adjourned. Outside the building, Taylor Davis spoke to a group of neighborhood residents and local organizers who had come to support her. They gathered near the steps, forming a small crowd of people that grew by the minute. Angela Peters stood on one side with a poster that read, "We are not invisible." A local pastor spoke through a megaphone. "This is not just justice for Taylor. This is justice for every door that was slammed, every lease that was ripped, every mother who cried in silence." David McClure joined them shortly after. He stood next to Taylor and said, "You were brave. And now they will not forget your name." Taylor looked out at the group. "This is not just my story. It is ours." And it is not over. Back inside her chambers, Judge Judy pulled out a sealed envelope marked private. It was from her late mentor, a retired judge who had warned her long ago about the blind spots in housing law. She opened it slowly and read the last line again. "The law must protect the people. If it protects only the system, then it is not law. It is just paperwork." She folded the letter back and placed it in her desk. Then she pulled out a blank notepad and began drafting a personal report to the state judiciary. Not for press, not for credit, just a record that somewhere. A judge had seen it happen a few hours later. Charles Whitman was escorted out the side entrance of the courthouse by his legal team. No reporters followed. No cameras flashed. The news cycle had already moved on. But the shame followed him like a shadow. His name now appeared on court records, not as plaintiff, not as owner, but as defendant, and soon, possibly as inmate. In the city housing office downtown, eviction folders were being reviewed. Dozens, then hundreds. Patterns began emerging. Clerks stopped filing and started reading. For the first time, they asked questions. Why were so many leases terminated after exactly 3 months? Why were white tenants given grace periods while others were not? Why did Charles Whitman only buy properties in 2 zip codes, both mostly black, both under-resourced for once? The files were not just paper. They were voices, and they had finally been heard. Judge Judy returned to the main courtroom the following morning. The air was quieter than usual, like the room itself knew a storm had passed and another was building. Her black robe flowed behind her as she stepped up to the bench and looked across the room. It was full again. But today was different. Today, it was filled with other landlords. And this time, they were not here to support Charles Whitman. They were here because their names had surfaced, not in the news, not in whispers, but in court-ordered subpoenas. Judge Judy had signed 15 overnight. At the front table sat Patricia Hughes, the attorney for the Tenants' Rights Coalition. She was ready with binders of evidence. Next to her sat 3 mothers who had come forward after seeing Taylor Davis speak. One by one, their stories aligned. Missed maintenance reports, false complaints, lease terminations that came out of nowhere. Judge Judy called the first case number. A hush fell over the room. The defendant was one Victor Chambers, owner of a dozen low-income buildings across 2 counties. He wore a navy suit, but it could not hide the tension in his shoulders. Patricia stood and spoke clearly, "Your Honor, we intend to show that Mr. Chambers used housing code violations selectively. He filed them only after tenants of color requested repairs. This pattern is documented across 9 properties. Judge Judy raised an eyebrow. Mr. Chambers, do you have representation? The man shook his head. No, Your Honor. I did not think this would go this far, Judge. Judy leaned forward. It always goes this far. You just never thought anyone would care. The court murmured. Reporters scribbled faster. The bailiff called for order. Patricia continued, we have sworn statements, copies of maintenance logs, and images showing repairs that were completed only after white tenants moved in. Judge Judy looked over the documents handed up to her. She nodded slowly. You are not here because you failed to fix a pipe. You are here because you built a system that decided who was worth the fix. Victor began to sweat. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the folder he brought. But he had no defense. Only excuses. I did not mean it to be racial. It was just policy. Judge Judy responded instantly. When a policy only hurts one kind of person, it is not a policy. It is a disguise. The gavel hit hard. This case will proceed to civil rights inquiry. Bailiff, please record the recommendation to city enforcement. Across the courtroom, Taylor Davis watched. Not as a victim anymore, but as a witness to change. Her son sat beside her, drawing quietly with crayons, unaware of the shift his mother had triggered in the city's legal machinery. Next came another case. Another landlord. Another story of silent harm. This one involved illegal surveillance cameras placed only outside apartments of black tenants. The landlord claimed it was for security. Judge Judy asked one question. Why were there no cameras outside the white tenants' doors? The landlord said nothing. Judge Judy did not need more time. This is not safety. This is targeted control. And you are now under investigation for violation of civil privacy law. The cases rolled in like a wave. And with each ruling, the courtroom became something more than a place for punishment. It became a spotlight. By midday, Judge Judy paused the proceedings. She called a short recess, but did not leave the bench. Instead, she asked the clerk to bring up a projector. We will now review the compiled eviction data submitted overnight by the City Housing Audit Team. The screen lit up with numbers. Charts. Red lines that spiked in black neighborhoods. Green lines that dipped in white ones. Everyone in the room stared. The numbers could not lie. The patterns could not be denied. Judge Judy pointed at the screen. These are not just dots on a graph. Each one is a family. Each one is a name. Each one should have been protected. At that moment, a local councilwoman stood up from the back row. Her name was Evelyn Walker. She had come unannounced, but was known to Judge Judy, Your Honor. I move that we bring this data to the City Council emergency hearing tonight. We need new ordinances. Not just court orders. Judge Judy nodded. Then bring the mothers with you. Bring the tenants. Let the lawmakers look them in the eye. The court clerk recorded the motion. The bailiff made copies of the charts. And Taylor Davis agreed to speak again. This time, to the lawmakers. But before the court closed for the day, there was one more surprise. Angela Peters, the witness from earlier, handed a sealed envelope to the clerk and asked him to pass it to Judge Judy. Inside was a letter from a former employee of Charles Whitman, a building manager, anonymous but verified. The letter listed names. Dozens, all families evicted, all black, all without cause. And it ended with one line: he kept a private list. He called it his rotate list. He said too many of them made the building look bad. Judge Judy stared at the letter. This is beyond a courtroom now, but she knew what had to be done. She called for a full criminal investigation. Not civil, not administrative. And for the first time in city history, a landlord was indicted on conspiracy to violate housing rights based on race. As she adjourned for the day, the applause from the hallway was faint but persistent. A ripple, a signal that the silence was broken. The courtroom doors opened again the next morning to a standing line that stretched out to the parking lot. Cameras waited at every corner. Reporters whispered into microphones. But inside the courtroom, the quiet was deafening. Judge Judy took her seat, eyes firm, robe sharper than usual. She scanned the room and saw a man in a beige jacket sitting alone on the back row. His name was Walter Green. Nobody knew him. Nobody noticed him. Until now. Judge Judy tapped the desk bailiff. "Bring forward Mr. Walter Green." The man looked startled. His hands trembled slightly as he stood and approached the witness stand. "Are you prepared to testify today?" He nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor, Judge." Judy nodded to Patricia Hughes, "Who state your role, for there had no label. Please state your role in the maintenance throat." "I was co-order maintenance supervisor for Whitman Properties. Mission concern for Whitman was porting of workers family." "For 8 years," Patricia asked gently, "did you ever witness racial discrimination in how tenants were treated?" Walter hesitated for one long second. "Yes. I was told not to fix anything in apartment C6 until they paid more rent, even though the mother had a signed lease with the amount agreed." "Judge," Judy leaned in. "And who told you this?" Walter responded without delay. "Charles Whitman. He told me." In person, gasps rang through the courtroom. Patricia opened the next file. "Do you have proof?" Walter reached into his jacket and handed the clerk a small audio recorder. "This is from the day I quit. I recorded it because I knew he would try to blame me later." Judge Judy pressed play. The courtroom heard Charles's voice. "You do not need to fix their heat. They will move when they get cold enough. Just make up a work delay if they ask." The room went dead silent. Judge Judy stopped the audio. "Bailiff, secure this evidence. Mr. Whitman is now under federal investigation. This case will no longer be confined to county court." Walter sat back down. His eyes were wet. Not from guilt, but from holding silence for too long. Judge Judy addressed the court. "We do not punish silence. But when silence ends, we move forward." Next came a twist that no one expected. One of the former tenants of Whitman Properties had filed a countersuit. Not against Charles Whitman, but against the city inspector who had signed off on her unit 3 times in 1 year while it was falling apart. Patricia called the inspector to the stand. His name was Glenn Matthews. Judge Judy looked at him carefully. "Mr. Matthews, you certified a building with 3 broken heaters, a leaky ceiling, and black mold behind the cabinets. Did you inspect it in person?" Glenn Matthews avoided her eyes. "No. I took Charles's report," he said. "It was handled." Judge Judy's voice rose. "You signed your name on a legal city document without setting foot in the unit." Matthews nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor, Judge." Judy slammed her hand on the bench. "That is not just negligence. That is willful fraud. And the consequences will be severe." She motioned to the court recorder. "Document this violation for disciplinary review and forward it to the city legal office, effective immediately for the next hour." The courtroom turned into a series of testimonies, not from professionals, but from tenants, from mothers, from elderly residents who had lost their homes. And at the center of it all sat Taylor Davis. She never cried. She never raised her voice. She only listened. Because everything happening now was because she stood up when no one else did. Then came the call for restitution. Patricia Hughes requested the court order emergency compensation for the victims affected by Charles Whitman's evictions. She listed damages: loss of property, emotional distress, homelessness, job loss due to forced relocation. Judge Judy nodded. "These damages are real, and they matter. But more importantly, we need to repair the system that allowed them to happen." She picked up her gavel, then paused. "Before I rule on this motion, I want to make one thing clear." She looked across the courtroom. "This is not about one bad landlord. This is about an ecosystem that decided black families were disposable." She then ruled, "This court hereby grants the motion for emergency restitution. In addition, the city is ordered to set up a tenant review board, staffed by former tenants, including Miss Taylor Davis." The courtroom gasped again. Taylor looked stunned. Judge Judy smiled. "You were brave enough to come here. Now help make sure no one else has to." The gavel struck. Restitution approved. The session ended with a slow rising of every person in the room, not for tradition, but for something deeper: respect. And still, the story was not over. As everyone stood to leave, a young man ran into the room, holding a box of documents. His name was Dennis Palmer. He was a former intern at Whitman Properties. Barely 23. He looked straight at the bailiff. "I need to submit this to the court. It is a list of all the fake maintenance reports Charles asked us to write. I found them in a storage unit." Judge Judy asked him to approach. The box was full of forged documents, dated, labeled, all matching the complaints filed by tenants. She looked at Dennis. "Are you ready to testify under oath?" He nodded. "Then be here tomorrow." "We are not done yet." The court adjourned. But the story had cracked wide open. The next morning, the courthouse swelled with pressure. Every seat taken, every breath quiet. Something heavy filled the air. Truth was coming, and the court could feel it. Judge Judy entered with purpose. Her robe flowed like armor. Her eyes locked on Dennis Palmer, the young man who had dared bring forward the hidden box. She spoke calmly, "Mr. Palmer, do you understand that what you submit today could become central to a criminal investigation?" Dennis nodded firmly. "Yes, Your Honor." Patricia Hughes stood beside him. She had spent all night reviewing the papers. Her voice was sharp and focused, "Your Honor. These are not just routine forms. These are internal memos, edited work logs, cancelled maintenance requests. They show a pattern of forced neglect and racial selection in repairs." Judge Judy raised an eyebrow. "Explain racial selection." Patricia pulled a document. "This form shows Unit D4 marked as non-priority. A note underneath says, 'Do not send technician.' Tenant is not our type." Another file, same handwriting, refers to Unit B3 as high value, with a side note saying, "Well kept, strong references, white family. Keep happy." The entire courtroom shifted in their seats. Judge Judy tapped the desk twice. "Let the record reflect that these documents indicate intentional discrimination based on race in repair scheduling and priority. This crosses into civil rights violations." She looked at Charles Whitman. "Mr. Whitman, you are now facing possible federal charges." Charles remained still. His lawyer looked like he aged 5 years overnight. But it was not over yet. Patricia presented one last file. This was the document that made Judge Judy's mouth fall slightly open. It was a training memo, titled Staff Guidance, written by Charles Whitman himself. The memo read, "Avoid deep investment in tenants that lower property value. Push out families that attract trouble, especially single mothers, especially those on rent subsidy. Keep our image clean." Judge Judy looked down, then looked back up. "Did you write this, Mr. Whitman?" Charles opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "Did you write this?" Charles finally spoke. "I wrote the policy. But it was never enforced." Judge Judy's voice boomed. "Never enforced. You evicted 12 families in 1 year. All single mothers. All black. All before lease expiration." She turned to Patricia. "Is there any record of eviction for a tenant outside that group in the last 3 years?" Patricia checked the summary file. "No, Your Honor." None. Judge Judy's face was unreadable. "Then your enforcement was loud and clear." She turned to the clerk. "Enter this into evidence. Title it Corporate Racial Policy." The gavel struck once. Now came a surprise. Taylor Davis requested to take the stand again. Judge Judy allowed it. Taylor stood, her hands steady, her voice powerful. "Your Honor, I want to say something not just to the court, but to every mother sitting at home, thinking nobody sees her." She paused. "I spent 3 weeks in my car with my son because a man in a suit decided I was a problem. I lost my job. I lost my son's school. But I did not lose my voice. And I will never let another landlord treat someone like they are less than human again." Judge Judy smiled slightly. "And that is why your name will be on the tenant review board." Taylor sat down. But the silence she left behind filled the room like thunder. Then came closing arguments. Patricia Hughes stood before the court. "This is not just about one family. or one landlord. This is about how systems allow racism to wear a suit and carry a clipboard. This is about how people get hurt while the law looks away. But not anymore, Judge Judy nodded. Mr. Whitman. You may speak. Before sentencing, Charles Whitman stood. For the first time. He looked shaken. He did not defend himself. He did not deny the papers. He simply said, I thought I was protecting the property. I forgot I was supposed to protect the people. Judge Judy stared at him. And for that, the people paid the price. She leaned forward. This court rules that Charles Whitman and Whitman Properties engaged in racially motivated housing discrimination, fraudulent record keeping, tenant abuse, and obstruction of housing rights. She continued, this court recommends federal prosecution, immediate seizure of internal records, and lifetime ban from all residential property management in the state. The courtroom held its breath. Then she turned to Taylor Davis and reminded us all what encouraged us that the truth still matters. And to Walter Green, you reminded us that silence can break. The gavel dropped. This hearing is adjourned. What parish hearing is adjourned? Justice has spoken. The room exploded. Reporters dashed for exits. Families clapped. Strangers hugged. And outside, crowds cheered in the sun, but inside. Judge Judy stayed seated. She looked down at the last file. One that had no cover, she whispered to herself. This was the case they almost buried. The case that never made it to video. Then she stood. Slowly, because today, justice had made it to daylight. The following day, the courthouse buzzed with energy, but this was a different kind of buzz. It was one of quiet victory. People whispered about the case. How a single mother had taken on a corporate empire and won. How a hidden world of discrimination had been exposed to the light of day. The air seemed to crackle with the change. Judge Judy entered the courtroom, her presence commanding immediate silence. Her robe fluttered behind her, like the final word in a case that had stretched longer than expected. She sat down at her desk, looking through a pile of documents. It was early, and the courtroom was still filling up with reporters, but they all knew what was coming. The end. Or perhaps the beginning of something far bigger. Bailiff. Call the last witnesses. Judge Judy's voice broke the silence, and the court officer stood up to announce the final segment of the case. Patricia Hughes, now standing beside Taylor Davis, looked over at the file that she'd been clutching for the last 2 days. Her fingers trembled with a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. She'd learned something else about Charles Whitman in the past 24 hours. Something nobody expected. A hidden stash of confidential files, buried so deep that even the most competent investigators hadn't managed to uncover it until now. She approached the stand with a new file, and Judge Judy, who had been watching the room, shifted her gaze to Patricia. Everyone knew the truth was coming, but this was the twist. Everyone felt it. Patricia stepped forward and said clearly, Your Honor, I have new evidence. Evidence that Charles Whitman has not only been engaged in racial discrimination for years. But he has been doing so under the guise of what appears to be a systematic cover-up. I have recently discovered a set of files, buried under the administration office, that are directly related to these cases. Files that never made it to the court or the media. There was a stir in the room. The lawyers, the journalists, the observers. They all leaned forward. Judge Judy looked at her. "What do these files contain?" Patricia held up a folder. It was thick, and the pages inside were official, stamped and signed by city inspectors. But they were unlike anything anyone had seen before. These are full reports. Orders from Whitman Properties to fabricate repair logs. Statements to hide racial motives in the evictions. Not only were black families evicted, they were specifically targeted to make room for tenants that would not devalue the property. Judge Judy was silent for a moment. Her eyes narrowed. This is bigger than just Charles Whitman. This implicates other parties. It involves systematic fraud. What do you propose we do? Patricia glanced at the group of reporters in the back, then back to Judge Judy, Your Honor. We recommend that these files be sent to federal prosecutors, that Whitman Properties be fully investigated, and that the families affected by these illegal practices be compensated beyond what we've already discussed. Judge Judy took a deep breath. She had been known to make swift decisions, but the gravity of this one was clear. This wasn't just about evictions anymore. This was about an entire infrastructure of exploitation. She turned to Charles Whitman, who had grown paler by the minute. "You've miscalculated, Mr. Whitman. This is not just a civil matter anymore. You will face federal investigation for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and violating civil rights under the Fair Housing Act." Charles opened his mouth to speak, but his words caught in his throat. His legal team had no arguments left. They were out of resources, out of ideas, and now out of time. Taylor Davis, still seated behind Patricia, sat up straighter. Her calm, quiet strength had become a beacon, and now she knew it was time to take the final step. She stood, unprompted, and addressed the court. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "I've been through a lot. I've lost so much. But I'm standing here because I refuse to let another family go through what I did. What we all did. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. I want to make sure this never happens again." Judge Judy's gaze softened for a moment. But it was a softening that was laced with steel. Taylor Davis had made it personal, and Judge Judy respected that. "Taylor, I hear you. Your strength is why this case will be remembered. Your courage is why we will move forward." Taylor smiled for the first time in days. A smile that was earned. Judge Judy turned to the court. "This court has made its ruling. The files will be handed over to the federal government for further investigation. Whitman Properties is now banned from all future management in the state. The full restitution will be granted to the families affected, and we will establish a permanent office for monitoring tenant rights with an oversight committee. It will be led by those who have been wronged. She paused, then added in a voice that was both firm and final. This case is closed. The record is set. The gavel came down with finality. The room erupted. But this time, there were no cheers of celebration. Only the quiet acknowledgement that this was just the beginning. Outside the courthouse, cameras swarmed. Reporters rushed to interview the tenants, the families, and the heroes of the case. Dennis Palmer and Walter Green were hailed as whistleblowers who had risked their futures to bring justice. But it was Taylor Davis, the single mother who had lost everything and found strength in the unlikeliest of places, who was the real star. As the crowds dissipated, a reporter asked Taylor, "What's next for you?" Taylor smiled softly. "Next, we make sure this never happens again." Days passed, but the impact of the trial lingered. News outlets across the country picked up on the case. But while the media buzzed, Judge Judy quietly went about her work. The case she had closed had already begun to shift the very foundation of housing law. But more importantly, it had shown the world that no matter how powerful you were, justice could reach you. Inside her chambers, Judge Judy sat alone, looking over the file one last time. It had been a whirlwind. But as always, she kept her composure. She had seen cases come and go, but this one felt different. She turned her chair slowly, staring out of the window at the quiet world beyond. Then the door opened. It was Patricia Hughes, looking just as composed as ever. She stepped inside, holding a sealed envelope. "Judge Judy," she said respectfully, "I thought you should see this." Judge Judy turned, looking at the envelope. Her eyes briefly flickered with recognition. She hadn't expected anything else to come through. But Patricia's expression told her it was important. Patricia sat down across from her. "Your Honor, I wanted to share something with you that might interest you. It's about the case we just closed. It turns out that Charles Whitman wasn't the only one running a racially discriminatory operation. There are several other landlords and property management companies involved. And it looks like they've been working together for years." Judge Judy's eyes narrowed. The case had been monumental, but now there was a revelation that threatened to overshadow even its impact. "What do you mean, Patricia?" she asked. Patricia opened the envelope, revealing several files and photographs. She slid them across the table. It was a new set of documents. This time, it wasn't just Whitman properties. These were records involving other companies and, alarmingly, higher-level connections. Landlords working together. Hidden exchanges of property. And more corruption than anyone could have imagined. Judge Judy read the documents carefully, her mind racing. The truth was unfolding, layer by layer. The files pointed to a vast network of exploitation, with Charles Whitman as just one link in the chain. "You're telling me that this is bigger than we thought?" she said, slowly. Patricia nodded. "Much bigger. And the families who were affected. They need to know. They need to be a part of the fight." but they need guidance. And we'll need all the help we can get to take this on, Judge. Judy closed the files, her jaw tightening. She had been the one to break the first case wide open. But now, the real battle began. "Patricia," she said firmly, "get me everything you can on this. We're going to take it all down." One landlord at a time. Patricia stood up. "Yes, Your Honor," and before she left the chambers, she turned to look at Judge Judy one last time. She smiled. "Thank you for believing. For never backing down, Judge." Judy didn't smile back, but her eyes softened. She had seen too many injustices in her career, too many faces scarred by the cruelty of power. But this time, the story wasn't over. This was just the beginning. As Patricia left, Judge Judy sat back in her chair, the weight of the case still heavy on her shoulders. But something had changed. She had started a movement that would not stop until every single person who had suffered at the hands of greedy, racist landlords was given the justice they deserved. And this time, no one was going to stop her.